When the Dark Lord Morgoth cursed the mortal man Húrin, he also cursed Húrin's family. And for the past 8 hours now of this series, I've spoken at length about Turin, the cursed son. But in this video, we are going to explore the rest of that family, the misfortunes of Morwen, the cursed wife, the cursed mother, and the tragedy of Niënor, her cursed daughter, the other child of Húrin's. Maya Govanen Melanin, and welcome to another installment in this series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Children of Húrin. So, Niënor, what that name means is mourning, as in the opposite of joy. And once upon a time, Niënor would have had an older sister, Lalaith, whose name meant laughter. But laughter died in Húrin's house before Niënor was even born. And the fact that Niënor's mother, Morwen, gave her a name so intimately associated with sorrow is an important point to focus on. From the very first moment that she entered the world, it was assumed that Niënor's life would be a calamity. She was born in the devastating year following the disastrous Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and so Niënor's father, Húrin, was already a captive of Morgoth's before she even came into being. She will never know him. She never knew her now dead sister Lalaith. She's never met her brother Turin, and she's never known anything but hardship and hunger and the oppressive rule of the tyrant Easterlings, who conquered her home before she was even born and enslaved her people while she was yet a baby. But, to be honest, it's pretty impossible to tell the story of Niënor without beginning with her mother, Morwen, the seemingly widowed wife of Húrin, the last hint of legitimate rule left in Dor-lómin. So, during these dark days of Niënor's childhood, her ancestral home lies under the dominion of Morgoth-worshipping men, Easterlings, who betrayed the Union of Maedhros, cost our heroes their victory in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and are thus massively responsible for a great many of the unnumbered tears that followed. And at this moment, the chieftain of the Easterlings, the warlord who rules Dor-lómin, is a despicable individual called Brodda. When Brodda came to Dor-lómin, he and his people dealt cruelly with the people of the House of Hador, robbing all that they owned and making them beggars and slaves. In fact, Brodda even took a kinswoman of Húrin's, a noble lady of Dor-lómin called Húrin, and he forced her to be his wife. During the childhood of Niënor, Dor-lómin was a desperate place indeed. However, despite the fact that Brodda is a warmonger of Morgoth's during the days of the Dark Lord's dominion, he is not without fear. He built a great hall from which to rule, he has a great number of warriors with which to subjugate the House of Hador, but he dared not yet lay hands on Morwen, the Lady of Dor-lómin, or thrust her from her house, for word ran among them that she was perilous, and a witch, who had dealings with the elves. Interestingly, it would seem that the specific reason for why the Easterlings fear Morwen so much is because they perceive in her a proximity to the elves. What her epithet, Elethwen, literally means is either elf-sheen or, a little less commonly, elven fair. And that Easterling phrase, witch wife, is but elf friend in the new language of these Morgoth worshipping men. When Brodda first looked into the fell eyes of Morwen, a great dread of her had seized him, and he was filled with a mortal fear. Morwen is a fascinating character, and she is many, many things, some great, some a little bit frustrating, but first and foremost among them, Morwen is terrifying to the likes of Brodda and his Easterlings. And, because of it, her daughter Niënor is spared the most sinister inclinations of Brodda's people, but she is not spared from hunger, or poverty, or winter. In fact, it's probable that both Morwen and Niënor would have starved under Easterling rule if not for the bravery and the compassion of that lady Húrin, the kinswoman of Húrin's, who is now the unwilling wife of Brodda. Behind her cruel husband's back, Húrin aided Morwen and Niënor in secret, gifting them food and supplies and the most basic necessities to keep them alive. In return, she was often beaten by her vicious husband. And so, for year after year after year, that was the way of things in Dor Lómin. Civilians were murdered, children were enslaved, and kind people were punished by the cruel invaders. Remember that. Brodda is a dick. Lady Húrin is an unsung hero, and Dor Lómin is now a place where women and children are treated as beasts of burden. This is going to be very important in the next video, when the son of Húrin will return to his ancestral home. He will confront Brodda and the Easterlings, and he will try to put things right. Except in the most Turin way imaginable. However, this video is all about the story of the daughter of Húrin and also the wife of Húrin, so for now I will stick with Turin's family. Despite the constant hardships of her childhood, Niënor eventually grows into a flower in the Grey North. She subsists in Dor Lómin under her mother's wing, flying beneath the radar of the Easterlings. In the year that Niënor turned 12, far off in the wilderness beyond Dor Lómin's borders, a group of outlaws, known as the Gaurwaith, took a new captain, calling himself Nathan the Wronged. By the year Niënor turned 15, rumours spread around her home of a great warrior atop the hill of Amon Rúth, whom the people knew as Gorthol, the Dread Helm, a staunch enemy of the true enemy. And in the year Niënor turned 17, Beleriand was just beginning to learn, for the very first time, about a mysterious masked man, wielding a black blade, calling himself the Mormegil. In the 5 years that followed, the Mormegil of Nargothrond took back the wild, piece by piece, orc by orc. And, as you surely know, during those 5 years of the Mormegil, there was a time of respite and hope, when, because of the deeds of the Mormegil, the power of Morgoth was stemmed west of Sirion, and all the woods had peace. Until one day, during that half-decade, in the year Niënor turned 21, Her mother Morwen Elethwen, the witch wife, the terror of Brodda, perceived that thanks to this mysterious Mormegil, the wilds beyond her home were now actually safer than Dor Lomyn was under Easterling occupation. And so, Morwen made the decision to leave her home forever, to flee into the wilderness and to escape from the boot heels of Brodda's people. And Niënor went with her. Together, they stole away over the mountains of shadow and down into no man's land. Morwen's plan was to head southeast and to bring her daughter to the very same elvish kingdom that she'd once sent her son to all those years ago. So, mother and daughter undertook the same long journey, and they adventured at last into the woodland kingdom of Doriath. By the leave of Queen Melian the Maya, Morwen and Niënor passed the girdle of Melian and came face to face with the High King of the Sindar, Elu Thingol. And within the capital city of the guarded kingdom of Doriath, Morwen hoped to find her son. They'd be reunited. Niënor would finally get to meet her brother. They would all live safely in Menegroth under the protection of King Thingol and Queen Melian, and both the surviving children of Húrin would live happily ever after. That was the plan. That was the story told to Niënor. So you can probably imagine their grief upon arriving in Menegroth to learn from Thingol and Melian that Húrin is gone. And since the wondrous dragon helm of Dor Lomyn vanished from the lands about Amon Rúth 5 years ago, no one in Doriath has any idea where Húrin is, or even if he's still alive. It must be quite the blow to Morwen. Desperately, she wants to go find her son, but just as desperately she needs to protect her daughter. And even during the days of the Mormegil, the wild is no place for either Morwen or Niënor to be wandering blindly in search of a guy who, it would seem, does not want to be found. And so, for 2 more years, Morwen and Niënor lived together in Doriath as guests of High King Elu Thingol and Queen Melian the Maya. They are treated with honour, and relative to what came before, things are pretty okay. For the first time, Niënor's immense potential as the daughter of Húrin, as the lady of the House of Hador, is actually nurtured. And things are, if not great, at least a little bit less not great. But with the passing of these 2 years in Doriath, we've now caught up to the present, to the events of the last video, to the Battle of Tumhalad, and the deaths of King Ordreth and Prince Gwyndor, and the ruin of Nargothrond, and the lies of Glaurung to Turin. And to Turin's terrible choice to either save Princess Finduilas and the rest of the captives from Nargothrond, or to save his mother and sister from the tyranny of the Easterlings. But he can't save them all. Just imagine how much happier this story could have been if only Turin knew what I've just told you. Morwen and Niënor aren't even in Dor Lomyn anymore. They are safe and sound with his foster parents in Doriath. Húrin could have gone after Finduilas and the other captives. I have no doubt he would have succeeded in saving them. Killing orcs is kind of his specialty. And then the obvious place to take them all would be Doriath. They could all have sought sanctuary within the girdle of Melian. Don't forget, Finduilas is the great-grand-niece of High King Eleuthingol. He would have welcomed her presence. Húrin could have had this wonderfully heroic homecoming, this redemption and reunion. Maybe he and Finduilas could have given their relationship another go. We could have had another elf-man union of the Elder Days. And if they did all come to Menegroth, whoa, happy days! Turns out, Húrin's mother and sister are already there waiting for him. Húrin's family could have reunited, Niënor would have met her brother, and things might have worked out. That is the ending we could have gotten if Húrin made the other choice. But he did not. Instead, he hastened to Dorlomin to save his mother and his sister from an Easterling chieftain they are currently living 250 miles away from. And as a result, Húrin left Finduilas and the other captives of Nargothrond to suffer a particularly brutal murder at the hands of the orcs. I guess it's very easy with a story like this to think, how can things get any worse? But don't think like that. There's one very important thing to remember about this story. Please, never forget. In the tale of the children of Húrin, things can always get worse. Have you even been paying attention? After the Battle of Tumhalad and the subsequent sack of Nargothrond, there came a particularly cruel winter. And because of this fell winter, very limited tidings came from Nargothrond to the rest of the world. Over in Doriath, the elves knew that something terrible had happened away in the southwest, but it was not until the winter withdrew that news of Nargothrond's utter ruin arrived in Doriath. Eventually, some small scattering of survivors who'd escaped the sack and survived the fell winter came at last seeking sanctuary within the refuge of King Thingol and Queen Melian. These few survivors from Nargothrond were found in the woods by the March Wardens and brought before Eleuthingol to tell their story. Glaurung the Dragon is now king of Nargothrond. The realm of Felagund is lost, and the Mormegil, well, that's just the thing. There are actually a few different accounts concerning what happened to him. Some survivors say that the Mormegil was slain. Others say he was cast under a spell by the dragon and remains there still, as if changed to stone. But there is one thing that every survivor agrees upon, and all declare that it was known in Nargothrond ere the end that the Black Sword was none other than Húrin, son of Húrin. Obviously, this news is devastating. It's devastating for Morwen, of course, and for Niënor, but it must also be devastating for Thingol and Melian, who raised Húrin for more years than Morwen did. They were his parents too. And I guess the worst part is, as Morwen herself says, such doubt is the very work of Morgoth. No one knows. Is Húrin dead? Or is he trapped under the dragon's spell? Does he lurk hungry in the woods? Does he linger in bonds? Or does he lie dead and unburied? Morwen insists they must find out. And Thingol wants to find out too. Remember, not only is Húrin the High King's foster son, but King Ordreth was the High King's great-nephew. Thingol does want to send a few scouts south to find out what they can, but at the same time, he is resigned to the belief that Húrin is indeed either slain or beyond rescue. And he fears that sending a large force out from Doriath to explore Nargothrond might in truth be the work of Morgoth to draw us on to some rashness. Understandably, I think Morwen is a little more hasty in her response, and she says to the king, "I would be rash. I would lose no hour to go to seek him." But Thingol suggests that surely neither Húrin nor Húrin, for that matter, would want Morwen to leave the safety of the Girdle of Melian in order to actively seek out danger in the wild. And to this, Morwen replies with what in any other circumstance I would have to suggest is a little bit of an overreaction. All Thingol said to her was, maybe don't wander knowingly into the dragon's dominion during the black peril of these days. But Morwen responds with, "You did not hold Húrin from peril, but me you would hold from him in the keeping of Melian, yes, a prisoner of the girdle. Long did I hold back before I entered it, and now I rue it." Which, Morwen is clearly in grief at this moment. Who am I to comment on her courtesy or abject lack of? What I will say, though, I can see where Húrin gets it from. He's not the only occasionally difficult and sometimes slightly over-proud member of his family, is he? Anyway, Thingol, very calmly and politely, responds with, "Nay, if you speak so, Lady of Dorlomin, know this. The girdle is open. Free you came hither, free you shall stay, or go." Which, right, is anyone else as amazed as I am that Elu Thingol is still on his best behaviour? I mean, he hasn't even tried to murder any of his in-laws yet, which is actually quite impressive, considering that Morwen is the daughter of Beren's cousin, and when Beren came to Doriath, Thingol tried to kill him. He's not outlawing anyone's entire language from being spoken, he's not imprisoning anyone in a treehouse, he's just being a thoughtful, considerate, and uncharacteristically delightful presence in this story. I just think the fact that Thingol is the one who's being calm and collected and sensible really is a huge degree of character growth. Good for you, Elu Thingol. Be the change you wish to see in the world. Anyway, it's actually Queen Melian, who up until this point in the conversation had been silent, who speaks next. She says, pretty unambiguously and forebodingly, "Go not hence, Morwen. A true word you said. This doubt is of Morgoth. If you go at his will." Now, I really like to think that if I were living in Middle-earth, I would listen to the super wise, angelic Maya being of whom there were none more wise nor more skilled. But, alas, just as Húrin ignored Círdan in the last video, wisest of all the elves, so too does his mother ignore the counsel of Melian, wisest of all the Maiar, except for one. Morwen decides that come hell or high water, no matter what anyone else says, she's going to Nargothrond to find her son, which means leaving behind her daughter Niënor. Morwen says a hasty farewell to Niënor, and though Niënor tries to restrain her mother, it is to no avail. By morning, Morwen has taken a horse and she is gone, towards the border of the Girdle of Melian and away from the guarded realm of Doriath. When Eleuthingol learned of this, he ordered that none should stay or waylay her, and she must be given free passage to ride where she pleased. But he also, more discreetly, ordered a company of his 30 hardiest and most skilled march wardens to follow Morwen into the wild and to guard her in secret, only showing themselves if danger threatens. And the guy Thingol sets in charge of this elite Sindar company is the chieftain of the March Wardens, one of the very best elves in Doriath, and once a very dear friend to Húrin himself, Mablung of the Heavy Hand. So, although Morwen departs by herself, beyond the protection of Thingol and Melian, she is not utterly alone. She just doesn't know it. Anyway, Morwen heads southwest, away from Menegroth through the forest of Region and down towards the shores of the river Sirion. However, it is in this part of the world that the mighty river Sirion is met by the river Aros, and the confluence of these two rivers form a marshy maze of lakes and creeks and waterways that are seemingly pathless and almost impossible to navigate. In the Sindarin tongue, this place is called Aelin Uial, which means the Meres of Twilight. And although there are quite a few obvious reasons why this part of the world is so difficult to pass through, it's not just geography that Morwen has to deal with. The wetlands of Aelin Uial are heavy with enchantment. Not only does it lie right on the border of the Girdle of Melian, but this land is also under the watch of the Valar Ulmo, the Lord of Waters. It was here that both Finrod Felagund and his cousin Turgon, son of Fingolfin, fell into a mystical sleep and dreamed the divinely inspired dreams that led to the founding of Nargothrond and Gondolin. And so, when Morwen arrives at Aelin Uial, she is forced to halt. The wide river flows far too fast for her to cross, and even if that weren't the case, it would be prohibitively dangerous to wander blindly into this pathless maze of reeds and crisscrossing waterways. But, and this probably goes without saying, Morwen is not the kind of person to let the fact that something is literally impossible deter her from trying it anyway. And thus, it is at this moment that Mablung of the Heavy Hand is forced to reveal himself and his company of 30 elves in order to save Morwen from herself and to prevent her from losing her way and probably losing her life by drowning in these twilit meres. When Morwen learns she's secretly been followed by Mablung and his company, she reacts exactly the way you'd expect Húrin to react, honestly. Once again, you can see where he gets it from. Morwen makes it painfully clear that no matter what Mablung says, she will never go back in life. She will not return to Doriath. The only direction she'll take is onward. And so Mablung is forced to say, "Then I must help you, though it is against my own will. Wide and deep here is Sirion, and perilous to swim for beast or for man." To which Morwen replies, "Then bring me over by whatever ways the elven folk are used to cross, or else I will try the swimming." Which, I mean, I don't want to over-criticize Morwen. She's very brave, her intentions certainly are noble, and she's a great example of a mother going to extreme lengths for her child. But at the same time, I do empathize with Mablung. Stay with Morwen. Protect her. Guide her back to safety. That is his mission. And boy, she is not making it easy. Mablung's only real options right now are either deliver Morwen directly into the super dangerous dominion of the dragon, or watch her drown trying to get there herself. I suppose when put like that, it's not really a choice at all. Mablung has no alternative but to reluctantly guide Morwen across the Niënor Uial, against his will. Back in the day, when Lord Finrod Felagund ruled Nargothrond, he and his fellow king / great-uncle Eleuthingol would send frequent messengers to and fro between the kingdoms of Nargothrond and Doriath, and the route that these messengers took was through the Niënor Uial. It's utterly unknown to outsiders, but for the March Wardens of Doriath, there is a passage through the marshes. Hidden amid the creeks and the reeds, there are stowed away secret ferries for the elves to use. And in the dead of night, beneath no light but starlight, Mablung and his 30 March Wardens use these ferries to guide Morwen all the way to the far side of this near impassable Mere of Twilight. But by the time the white mists of the marshes are behind them, and Morwen has crossed into the realm of Nargothrond, the sun begins to rise red over the blue mountains. A morning wind scatters the night's fog, and Morwen looks upon the 30 elves in her company. She watches them pass silently over the river, but when the very last one comes ashore, she suddenly gives out a cry. There are no longer 30. Now, she counts 31. She points to the final elf and says to Mablung in dismay, "Whence came he?" But in that moment, the rider's hood is blown back, and the rising sun beats down upon golden hair. This is not an elf, and it's not a he. Thus it was revealed to them that Niënor, daughter of Húrin, had followed the company and joined them in the dark before they crossed the river. This family, man, I love them, but God do I pity Mablung. He's already had to deal with Turin's self-destruction all those years ago. He's actively trying to prevent Morwen from doing the exact same thing. And now he's got another cursed member of Húrin's family to deal with? One more thing that can go wrong with this ludicrously ill-conceived rescue mission to Nargothrond. You guys remember that time back in the tale of Beren and Luthien, when the mightiest werewolf ever to walk the world swallowed a Silmaril and then came ravening upon Doriath as the most dreadful of all the terrors to burst from the north with ruin upon the world? Yeah, well, when that happened, Mablung, along with King Eleuthingol, wonderful Beleg Cuthalion, Beren himself, and beloved Huan, the bestest boy in all of Middle-earth, they went out to slay this mightiest werewolf and to save the day. It is true that 2/5 of them died, but not Mablung. He successfully cut the Silmaril from the werewolf's belly, making him one of only a special few characters ever to hold a Silmaril, and he placed it in Beren's hand to give to the king. The reason that I bring this up is because in the Children of Húrin, we are specifically told Mablung dreaded that, hunting the ultimate Silmaril-enhanced werewolf with only 3 other dudes and a dog, less than he dreads trying to keep safe Morwen and Niënor, even with 30 of his mightiest March Wardens also watching their back. From Mablung's perspective, keeping an eye on Húrin's cursed family is more stressful than the most stressful thing that has ever happened in Doriath thus far. And you know what? He's not even wrong. This is worse. But this is also a pretty epic moment for Niënor. In truth, little fear was seen in her face or her bearing. Tall and strong she seemed, for of great stature were those of Hador's house, and thus clad in elvish raiment she matched well with the guards, being smaller only than the greatest among them. When Morwen sees her daughter, she is dismayed, and she immediately commands Niënor to go back. But to this, Niënor has a pretty good comeback. If the wife of Húrin can go forth against all counsel at the call of kindred, then also can Húrin's daughter. Which makes things difficult for Morwen. On the one hand, she tells Niënor to listen to the counsel of others, don't be rash. But on the other hand, one could argue that 100% of Morwen's decision-making thus far has been defined as not listening to the counsel of others and being rash. So she doesn't really have much of a leg to stand on. And unlike literally every other member of her immediate family, at this moment Niënor is actually being relatively sensible. She's not ridden out in secret because she wants to join her mother's quest. Instead, she's come all this way because she agrees with the counsel of Melian. She's hoping that her presence will convince Morwen to escort her back to Doriath. For in truth, Niënor had come most in hope that for fear and love of her, her mother would turn back. And Morwen was indeed torn in mind. Niënor says, "It is long since I was a child. I have a will and wisdom of my own. I go with you. Rather to Doriath, for reverence of those that rule it, but if not, then westward." Now, I want to draw attention to that reverence of those that rule it reference. This is another aspect in which I think Niënor stands out from the rest of her family. When Túrin was in Doriath, he demonstrated quite a bit of ingratitude when he ran away from the kingdom without even explaining himself to its king / his foster father. Morwen was also pretty rude to the king and queen after they treated her with honor as a guest for 5 years. And it hasn't happened yet, but one day Húrin himself is also going to have a bit of a confrontation with Thingol and Melian. But Niënor alone, she actually seems to want to be in Doriath. She actually seems to respect its rulers, and she heeds their counsel. Well, sort of. I mean, she is literally going against that counsel right now by coming here to find her mother, but it is, I think, out of respect for Thingol and Melian that she is admittedly doing the exact opposite of what they advised, but still, relative to the rest of her family, that is quite the extraordinary display of deference to the opinions of others. She's not actually taking the advice, but she's at least aware that there is good advice being given. Anyway, in the end, Morwen could not overcome her pride, and would not be led back by her daughter as one old and doting. "I go on as I have purposed," she said. "Come you also, but against my will." Which, again, just so frustrating for Mablung. Now Niënor's coming along against the will of Morwen. Morwen's going along against the will of Mablung. Niënor is also going against the will of Mablung. This whole thing is against the will of Mablung, but he's the only one who doesn't get a choice. He must guide and protect Morwen and also now Niënor, and he is bound to their journey through the wild. That is his mission, appointed to him by his king and his queen. And so, all he can do is insist that both Morwen and Niënor go the rest of the way on horseback, and they should ride among the elven company, straying not 1 foot from them. And with that, the 33 of them pass beyond the wetlands of reed and willow, and they come to the southern plain before Nargothrond. The next day, they saw nothing but desolation and heard nothing, for the lands were silent, and it seemed to Mablung that a present fear lay upon them. 31 years ago, Morwen's first cousin, once removed, Beren himself, walked these exact paths towards Nargothrond. But back then, this woodland was filled with the hidden eyes of elvish archers, guardians of the hidden realm. But now, the woods are utterly silent. The people of this land are gone. On the evening of their 3rd day from the river, they draw near to the broken gates of Nargothrond, and a great unease suddenly comes upon Mablung. He begs Morwen and Niënor to go no further, but Morwen laughs at him and says, "You must endure us a little longer. We are come too near now to turn back in fear." So, Mablung makes the fair point that they are fey and foolhardy. And although he was ordered not to halt them by force, he was also ordered to guard them. And within the desolation of the dragon, he cannot carry out both orders. So he chooses to guard them, and he says to Morwen and Niënor, "Tomorrow I will lead you to Amon Ethir, the spy hill that is near, and there you shall sit under guard and go no further while I command here." Now, Amon Ethir is a tall tree-grown mound which was raised by Finrod Felagund centuries ago to serve as a lookout hill. Mablung leads Morwen and Niënor to its summit, and they all look out at the broken doors of Felagund, the broken terraces of Nargothrond, and the broken bridge of Turin's. But even to Mablung's keen elvish eyesight, they see no sign of the dragon. Scorch marks scour the ground, but there is no sound. All is silent beneath the pale sun. And so, Mablung separates 10 of his riders from the rest, and he orders them to remain with Morwen and Niënor atop the spy hill, where they are to wait for Mablung and the other 20 March Wardens to return from scouting out Nargothrond. And before Mablung leaves them, he gives an incredibly clear command. Stay on this hill, unless there comes any sign of the dragon. If that happens, the 10 riders must set Niënor and Morwen in their midst and flee as swiftly as they might back towards Doriath. They are not to wait for Mablung, they are not to try and help the other 20 March Wardens, they are to get the hell away from Nargothrond. Everyone acquiesces to Mablung's command, and so he leaves Morwen and Niënor and 10 riders atop the peak of the spy hill, and he sets off with the rest of his company towards the broken bridge of Turin's and the blackened doors of Felagund. The March Wardens stealthily scatter amid the desolation, each one creeping silently towards the doors, but Mablung takes the lead, and as he nears the fast-flowing river, searching for a way to cross to sneak inside Nargothrond, he is eventually spotted by the dragon. We are specifically told the glance of Glaurung's fell eyes was keener than the sight of the great eagles, and it far exceeded the eyesight of any elf. In fact, one could argue that Glaurung may potentially have the best eyesight of any character in Middle-earth. He lies within the shadow of the great passage before the ruined doors, and although Mablung is a master of stealth and secrecy, the dragon not only spots him, but he also spots Mablung's other companions, including those 12 that are waiting far off atop the peak of Amon Ethir, the Spy Hill. Suddenly, just as Mablung is about to ford the wild river and climb up the far side of the broken bridge, Glaurung comes forth with a great blast of fire. He pays no heed to Mablung, and instead he leaves Nargothrond and slithers down into the stream. Then, straight away there comes a vast hissing, and huge vapours arise from the water. Mablung and his followers are suddenly all engulfed in a blinding steam and a foul stench. Most of them flee back towards the Spy Hill, but Mablung takes cover and hides from the dragon. He thinks about Niënor and Morwen, but then he also thinks about Húrin. His command was unambiguous, and with the dragon now passing over the plain, surely his riders will already be bearing Morwen and Niënor back to the safety of Doriath. They'll do their duty, and Mablung must do his. And so, with Glaurung gone from Nargothrond, Mablung seizes his opportunity to sneak inside the conquered kingdom, to search the polluted passageways and the desecrated chambers, and to hopefully find the lost son of Húrin. Now, in full fairness to Morwen and Niënor and the 10 riders Mablung left behind to protect them, they do all do exactly as they were commanded. At the very moment Glaurung issued forth from the broken doors as a vast shape in the evil vapour, the watchers upon the Spy Hill spot him, and without debate Morwen and Niënor are bidden to mount a pair of horses and to flee east, away from Nargothrond and away from the dragon. However, shockingly, things don't end up going as planned. As Morwen and Niënor ride down the eastern slope of Amon Ethir, an ill wind blows Glaurung's foul vapours upon them, carrying an evil stench that no horses could endure. Blinded by the fog and in mad terror of the dragon reek, the horses ran wild and soon became utterly ungovernable, even for the elves. The guards are scattered by their frenzied steeds, and many are dashed against trees or carried off into the monstrously malevolent mist. Absolute chaos descends. The cries of the riders calling out the names of Morwen and Niënor are drowned out by the terrified neighing of their panic-stricken horses. And when Glaurung hears all this tumultuous noise, this disordered pandemonium that he's inflicted upon his foes, he is well pleased. We are told that one of the elf riders strove with his horse in the fog, trying desperately to bring it back under control, and as he does so, the Lady Morwen suddenly rides past him. He calls out to her, but she doesn't hear. She's crying out for her daughter, for Niënor. Morwen hastens past this elf like a grey wraith upon a mad steed, but then she vanishes amid the mist. And though the elves continued to call her name, Morwen never returned. She simply disappeared into the dragon's reeking fog, and she was never seen again by any elf, ever. Now, this isn't quite the end of Morwen's story. We will see her again before it's all over, but Mablung won't, and Niënor won't. and Thingol and Melian won't, and Húrin won't. From their perspective, Morwen is gone forever. She simply vanished among the vapours of Glaurung, and no one, except her, will ever know exactly what happened. Morwen's fate will be one of the great mysteries of the Elder Days. But, as compelling as that may be, it is the fate of Niënor that we need to focus on right now. While her mother disappeared like a grey wraith in a malodorous mist, a mad terror fell upon Niënor's horse. It ran wild. It stumbled and it threw Niënor to the ground. She fell onto soft grass and was thus unhurt, but when she stood, she found that she was utterly alone, lost in the mist without horse or companion. She heard cries all about her, but she could see no one. And before long, the cries grew ever fainter. But Niënor is not the kind of person to panic. Instead, she decides to seek once again the hill of Armonethir. For surely Mablung would return there before heading back to Doriath, even if only to make sure that no one was left behind. And so, Niënor followed the slopes upward. She climbs and climbs until finally the evil fog grew thinner, and she came at last into sunlight atop the peak of the Spy Hill. But as Niënor gathered her bearings and looked westward towards Nargothrond, she discovers that she is not alone. She steps forward, and suddenly there is the head of Glaurung the Golden watching her. Before she was even aware of the danger, Niënor looked into the terrible eyes of the Dragon King, and she beheld within them the fell spirit of Morgoth, his master. Just like her brother, Niënor is also caught by the wicked glance of Glaurung, and she falls under his diabolical spell. But, just like her brother, strong was the will and heart of Niënor, and she strove against Glaurung, but he put forth his power against her. The dragon demands to know why she's come and what she seeks, and his wicked power forces Niënor to give an answer. She says, "I do but seek one Húrin that dwelt here a while, but now he is dead, maybe." To which Glaurung responds again in a very similar vein to how he responded to Húrin during their conversation. Glaurung looks Niënor in the eye, and he lies. And this isn't even one of those, half lies or distortions of the truth. What Glaurung tells to Niënor is the absolute opposite of what actually happened. The dragon says, in reference to Húrin, "He was left here to defend women and weaklings, but when I came he deserted them and fled. A boaster, but a craven, it seems." Now, again, just like her brother, Niënor is bold and brave and badass. She would never tremble before a servant of Morgoth's. She would never give him that satisfaction. Unfortunately, though, just like her brother, Niënor is a little bit too brave and bold and badass. She stands up to Glaurung, she defies him, she defends her brother, and in so doing, she seals her own fate. Niënor says to the dragon, "You lie. The children of Húrin at least are not craven. We fear you not." And to that, Glaurung laughs. for in her courage, Niënor has just revealed herself to the malice of the dragon. He didn't even have to extract it from her, she freely volunteered the information. Here stands the cursed daughter of Húrin. The dragon put forth his power, and he drew Niënor's gaze into his own. And it seemed to her that the sun sickened and all became dim about her. And slowly, a great darkness drew down upon her, and in that darkness there was emptiness. She knew nothing, and heard nothing, and remembered nothing. It's at this point that I want to briefly remind you about Niënor's father. 24 years ago, Lord Húrin was captured by Morgoth and imprisoned atop a peak of Thungarodrim. And there he is still forced to look out upon the evil and despair that is afflicting his family, his loved ones. It is his doom to see through Morgoth's eyes, and to hear with Morgoth's ears, and to have nothing hidden from him. Now, obviously, Glaurung is not Morgoth, but he is Morgoth's creation. I wouldn't go so far as to call him Morgoth's son, that seems a bit on the nose, but he is Morgoth's masterpiece. He is, to an extent, Morgoth's progeny, and we know that he is definitely an agent of Morgoth's curse. And it is seemingly through the eyes of Glaurung that Morgoth's malicious magic is transmitted. So, in this moment, is it through Glaurung's eyes that Húrin is seeing? Is he watching what's happening to his daughter in real time through the eyes of the monster responsible? Was he watching when Glaurung told Turin the lie that sent him back to Dorlomin instead of going after Finduilas? The answer is definitely yes. It might not literally be through Glaurung's eyes, the curse is kind of mysterious, but it is absolutely certain that in one capacity or another, Húrin is watching all of this as it unfolds. He is seeing his daughter's suffering, but he is powerless to help her. It's just one more layer of tragedy in this already desperately tragic story. Anyway, whilst all of that is going on with Niënor and the dragon, meanwhile, Mablung is still exploring Nargothrond. He wanders through abandoned chambers, braving the dark and the dragon's stench, but not one living thing does he find. Nothing stirs among the bones, and no one answers his cries. At last, when he is utterly oppressed by the horrors of the place and fearing the return of Glaurung, he reluctantly decides that if Turin is still alive, he most certainly is not still here. So, Mablung departs Nargothrond, but as he crosses the river, he suddenly sees the evil shape of the dragon returning amid the mist. Within moments of arriving on the eastern shore, Glaurung draws near. But now he is slow and stealthy, for all the fires in him had burned low, and a great power had gone out of him. The dragon writhes through the water and slinks back up into Nargothrond like a huge snake, ashen grey, sliming the ground with his belly. And there, Glaurung will rest. He'll sleep in the dark and renew his strength until his next emergence. But just before the dragon disappears, he turns around and he looks at the place where Mablung is hiding. Then there came from him the laughter of Morgoth, dim but horrible, as an echo of malice out of the black depths far away. And after that, in a voice that is cold and low, the dragon says, "There you lie, Mablung the Mighty. Haste you now to the hill, and see what is become of your charge." With that, Glaurung passes back into his lair, and Mablung hurries as swiftly as possible back towards the spy hill. And when he gets there, what he finds is a figure, dark and still, as it were an image of stone. Niënor is alive, but changed. Just like Húrin, she has been frozen by the dragon's spell, but unlike her brother, Glaurung never released Niënor. He simply obliterated her mind, and then left her that way. Mablung takes Niënor's hand and she stirs, but her wide eyes see nothing, her ears hear nothing, and her lips speak no words. For an awful moment, Mablung slips into despair. He reckons his elvish company must be all slain. Morwen has vanished beyond recall, and Niënor alone has been spared, but not in mercy. And the question now, what to do next? If he prioritizes Niënor's well-being and hastens her back to Doriath, he'll be abandoning Morwen. If he goes in search of Morwen, he'll be leaving Niënor in danger. As with so many choices in this story, there can be no winning. Either way, and again, just like Húrin, Mablung must forsake one of the women in his care in order to protect the other. In the end, he chooses to stay with Niënor and to lead her back home to Doriath. There at least something positive might still be possible. And so, walking like dreamers, Mablung and Niënor leave Nargothrond, and they begin their long journey back towards Thingol and Melian. And before too long, they are actually found in the wilderness by 3 of the elves of Mablung's company, possibly the only 3 survivors out of 30. Their presence inspires a return of hope in Mablung, and together they all journey back towards the guarded realm. However, they do not take the same route they left by. Instead, Mablung sets off into the wilderness, taking a pretty much straight line, planning to enter the kingdom of Thingol at the point where the river Sirion meets the river Esgalduin. It's a long and difficult journey, but as they pass further from Nargothrond and closer to Doriath, little by little, Niënor's strength returns, and she is able to at least walk for hours at a time. But only if led by the hand. If Mablung lets go, she simply stops and stands still. After many, many long days and nights, finally they arrive near the west border of Doriath. Tomorrow they'll pass the girdle of Melian and make it safely back to Menegroth. So, that night they sleep. Niënor lies on a couch of grass and she closes her eyes in rest for the first time since falling under the dragon's spell. The elves rest too, believing they are close enough now to Doriath that they need not fear orcs. But in these dark days of Morgoth's dominion, that is naive. Nowadays, orcs roam even up to the very edge of Melian's girdle, and while the elves sleep, they are assailed unawares by a war band of orc hunters. Now, these elves aren't any old elves, they are the mightiest of the March Wardens of Doriath, and so despite being caught by surprise, and despite the fact there's only 4 of them, they still put up a pretty good fight. But as they do, a strange change comes over Niënor. Suddenly, she runs, bolting blindly into the woods. The orcs chase after her, but Niënor outruns them all, flying like a deer among the trees, with her hair streaming in the wind of her speed. Within moments, the orcs are themselves overtaken by Marblung and his 3 hunters, and each one is swiftly slain, down to the least and last. But by the time the orcs are dead, Niënor is gone. Just like her mother, Niënor passed into the wilderness like a wraith and vanished. Marblung hunted for days, but even to his keen elvish senses, there was no sign of her. Eventually, he had no choice but to return to Menegroth in grief and in shame, and to reveal his perceived dishonor to the king and queen. Morwen is gone. Niënor is lost, and in the mind of Marblung he has failed utterly. But he hasn't. It's not his fault that Morgoth cursed Húrin's family with evil fortune and ill chance, and High King Eleuthingol says to Marblung, "Grievous indeed is the end of all Húrin's kin, but it lies not at your door." Nevertheless, Marblung still holds himself responsible, if not for their fate, at least for their well-being. And so, although every single member of Húrin's immediate family, including Húrin himself, is now believed to be dead, or at least gone forever, Marblung keeps going. He departs Doriath, and just as his fellow legend Beleg Cuthalion once spent year after year searching the wild for the lost son of Húrin, so too does Marblung spend 3 whole years hunting the wilderness for Húrin's lost daughter. Up and down Beleriand, never halting, never resting, and never giving up. But the tragic truth is this: Marblung is never going to find her. He will never see Niënor again. He will never see Morwen again. One day, he is destined to cross paths with Turin again. It might not seem like it from the perspective of everybody else, but the tale of the children of Húrin is not over yet. And so, with that, I will segue the story back over to Turin. And in the next video, we'll take a look at what he's been getting up to during the events of this video. His journey home to Dor-Lómin, his encounter with the Easterlings, and his vengeance upon their chieftain, Brodder. So, To make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. However, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair Melanin.